We can wait.
All right, the recording is on.
Okay.
Aneta, take it away.
Okay, so today we have Karthik Reddy from University of Maryland. Karthik is a student, grad student, last year student of Marcos Georgiontopoulos in Maryland, and his primary research topic is X-ray jets and jets in general from quasars. So he's been working on Chandra data and quasar samples, published a paper which was very nice and presented actually this paper at the summer meeting, Chandra meeting, was it right? Yeah, it's one meeting, one probably.
Actually, both in the AIG. So
yeah.
For some reason, you know, this past 3 talks have all been finalists of the AIG student paper contest. So,
exactly, that's what it was. So it was about the offsets between the X-ray and radio nodes, which Karthik was looking at. So here he visited us for last 2 months to work on LIRA more, because he was working on LIRA for the first paper. So I hope this actually helped him, but I'm sure it helped us because we got more of the code updates during this time, and now also Axel is here, who is converting. Both of them are working on moving LIRA from R to Python, so we'll have a nice Python interface. But today, Karthik will talk about his work related to X-ray jets and radio jets, right?
Okay. All right. Just a quick note before Karthik begins. Since there are a lot of new people who may not be familiar with how we do these talks, feel free to interrupt at any time. You know, we have Q&A time built in to the whole thing. So thank you.
All right. Thank you. Thanks for having me here, and thanks for joining me today. So I'm going to talk about an interesting problem on extragalactic jets related to their X-ray emission. I'm going to discuss how I used a statistical tool called LIRA to extract some morphological clues to understand the nature of their X-ray emission. So the history of X-ray emission from AG and jets dates back to 1999. It was when the Chandra Observatory was launched, and when the ground team was trying to calibrate its optics using a distant quasar called POC 0637-752. The ground team assumed that this quasar was going to be a bright point source in the X-rays. So they chose this source to calibrate its optics. But instead, what it returned was a bright, not only a bright X-ray point source, but also a 100 kiloparsec long X-ray jet. Now, Chandra has detected around 200 X-ray jets so far, and we are still uncertain on how some powerful of these jets produce X-rays on kiloparsec scales. So one way to understand the problem here is to look at their ACDs. So these jets generally shine bright in the radio and sometimes also produce emission in the infrared or optical. And this low energy part of the spectrum can be explained by a single synchrotron component, but sometimes it may also require 2 spectral components within this energy range. So synchrotron here is the radiation produced when charged particles gyrate in magnetic fields. So if we extend this tail into the X-rays, we wouldn't expect to detect any meaningful emission from them. But in reality, these jets are extremely bright in the X-rays. And this has several jets show this kind of requirement for a second spectral component. So there are two main explanations possible. One is that there are probably extremely low energy electrons in the jet that produce emission somewhere around here, which also makes it extremely difficult to detect emission from them. They upscatter the cosmic microwave background from the microwave wavelengths to the X-ray wavelength. So this is usually called the ICCMB or the Innes-Compton model. And this generally requires large bulk clearance factors for the kiloparsec scale jets, and also requires the jet to be aligned at small angles to our line of sight. Oh, okay. So the alternative explanation is that there are a separate high energy electron population that's different from the ones that produce radio and infrared, the low energy part of the spectrum, that produce X-rays via synchrotron. Now, the main issue here is that although both these models can explain the X-ray emission from these jets, they predict large differences in the jet powers that gets dumped back into the host galaxy and the galaxy cluster. Now, this is an important parameter in studying galaxy evolution. There are a few spectral diagnostics that have been proposed to distinguish between these two mechanisms. For example, if we assume that the jet is homogeneously distributed with low energy and high energy electrons, if the electrons here are producing the X-rays via Innes-Compton to generate the observed X-rays, and so the electrons here would also upscatter the same CMB photons to produce a large gamma ray emission. But in several of these jets, the Fermi telescope has placed much lower upper limits on the available, observable emission from these jets. So that's one problem with the simple one-zone ICCMB model. The main problem with the second synchrotron model is the very nature of the second electron population is unexplained. Why should there be a second electron population? Apart from these spectral diagnostics, one way to further constrain the emission mechanism is by studying their X-ray radiomorphology. So this is a typical image of an X-ray jet with the radio contours overlaid on top. The nomenclature would be the bright structure. This is called the core. The intermediate structures are called knots, and the terminus is where the jet rams into the external medium and dumps most of its energy there. This is called the hotspot. What I am interested in is knowing how these knots could produce X-rays. Now, apart from their X-ray emission mechanism, we also don't know several properties of these jets. Like, we don't know how fast they move on kiloparsec scales. We don't know what is their exact plasma composition, etc. Now, in general, when the ICCMB is used to interpret the X-rays from these jets, they typically assume that the radio and X-ray emitting electrons share the same emitting volume, but are generally unaware of any structure in the jet. And in only a few cases, synchrotron and structure has been involved while interpreting these X-rays via synchrotron mechanism. There is a subtle feature in these jets that can help us further constraining the emission mechanism. So let's take this knot, for example. If you look closely, the X-rays peak and decay before the radio. Now, if we are trying to interpret these X-rays in a simple one-zone modeling approach, we should expect we should expect the X-rays and radio to coincide, but not the X-rays to decay before the radio. So even before we even talk about any spectral constraints, these offsets put a constraint on the emission model by requiring that the emission volumes are separate, at least partially. So we may ask, what exactly are these offsets? What's producing them? or we may go even deeper and ask what could be these knots, what's producing these knots, and can these offsets tell anything about how these knots are produced, and in turn how they produce X-rays? So before we attempt to answer these questions, what we would want to know is what are the statistics of these offsets? Are there any trends in them, or are they confined to specific types of knots, or are they there everywhere? So to do that, I looked at a large sample of Chandra detected X-ray jets and searched for offsets in them. So this large sample can be broadly divided into two categories. The jets with snapshot observations, which will have only a few counts in their jets, and the other ones with high count, or like with deep Chandra observations. So if it's a high count jet, and then if you have a large offset, we can simply construct a centroid and characterize the offset in a straightforward manner. One problem with low count jets is that, for example, let's take this knot. We have only about 5 counts in this region. There can be contribution from the background. There can be contribution from the bright core. Now, even if we knew about the contributions of these two components into this knot, we still won't be able to construct or measure its centroid. Ideally, what we would require is to extract the underlying brightness distribution of this observation. And before we attempt to compute an offset, we should also need to estimate the statistical significance of any emission that we find in this region after accounting for the effects of background and the bright core. So I use a statistical tool called LIRA, which is the short name for low count image reconstruction and analysis. So I'll give a brief overview on how LIRA works. So LIRA assumes that the image is LIRA basically models an image as a combination of two components. One is the baseline component, which contains any known features in the image. So I know that there is a bright core and there is also some form of background in the jet. And this added component will contain any other features that are unexplained by the baseline model. So if we superimpose these two components and convolve it with a user specified PSF, we'll get back the observation. So what LIRA does here is that it fits this baseline and added components using a flexible multi-scale model, and then it uses a Monte Carlo sampler to generate several realizations of the underlying brightness distribution after accounting for the baseline. So we can use these sequence of images to estimate the statistical significance of any structure that we find and the added component, and also use them simultaneously to compute or detect an offset in such knots. So to test for statistical significance, what we would do is that we take the baseline, create several replicates of the baseline, and then run LIRA on each of those baselines and generate several added component images. We do the same thing also on the observation. Now, let's say if we want to determine the statistical significance of any emission that we find in this region, we consider this test statistic, which is the fraction of the total emission that's found in the added component. Now, because we have several realizations of the added component, we'll obtain a distribution. So now we have several distributions of the parameter xi, one each from the replicates, and then one for the observed image. So what we do here is that we take the 99.5% tail of the mean of the replicate distribution, and then we'll estimate the area under the observed image from that point. So if the emission in the observed image was simply due to some background fluctuation, these distributions won't be much different from each other. So larger the area under this curve, larger is going to be the significance. So that means we can go from an image that looks like this, and we can generate several added component images, and then average them to produce a core and background subtractor deconvolved image. Now, before talking about computing an offset, we also need to align the radio and X-ray cores to measure these relative offsets. There is a known asymmetry in the Chandra observations. So this is one example where the observation is subtracted with a simulated PSF, and then the residual shows excess emission in a specific direction, and this residual is about 5% of the total flux in the core. So to estimate how much of an uncertainty is there in the localization of the core, what I did was I took each observation and then I generated several realizations of the added component with a flat baseline. So, and then I computed the centroid for each of these observations, and the uncertainty appears to be less than around 0.08 arc seconds for the core. So to claim an offset to be significant, I start with this threshold first, and then one issue here in computing an offset is going to be that we don't know the actual boundary of the emission that we detect in our observations. So what I do is I construct an ROI that only surrounds the radio image, and then I compute the centroid of the emission using those added component images within that region. So that will tell us whether the bulk of the X-ray emission coincides with the radio peak or not. Now, so I tested this method with a high count jet, which has a known and measured offset of about 1 arc seconds. So this is a deep Chandra observation of Park 605-08, which has around 1,000 counts in this knot. What I did was I divided this observation into small chunks of around 2 kilosecond observations, which produced around 5 to 6 counts in each knot. And then I ran LIRA on each of those images, and then I estimated statistical significance, and then I computed the centroid difference using those.
Karthik?
Yeah.
Karthik?
Yep.
So I don't know if it's just me, or is everyone seeing a lag between what you're showing versus what's actually showing on the screen?
No.
No? Okay, then it's just me. All right, continue. Sorry.
Okay,
Yeah.
looks good.
Okay. So I computed the centroid differences on all these low count images, and then what I found was that the centroid computed from the LIRA image peaked at the actual value, while the centroid computed directly on the observations peaked at a smaller value and also showed some large outliers. Now, coming back to high count jets, now if the offsets are evidently large, like say 2 or 3 pixels, so this image is been to half s pixels, so the pixel size would be about 0.25 arc seconds. For larger offsets, the centroid difference method would again work, but for smaller offsets, say that are about around a pixel or 1.5 pixels, there can be contribution from the nearby point source or nearby nodes or a bright core or even a high background, and they may induce some kind of uncertainty in the centroid that we compute. So I use the same method again on high count images as well to produce core subtracted and background subtracted deconvolved images. Before I go into discussing few results on systematic uncertainties in these analysis, I'll describe a few sources with some interesting features in them. So this source shows a clear naughty structure with.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
You could, if you're just worried about the shape of the PSF, you could try 2 point sources, let's say 2 stars or so, where we know the distance from each other and we know there are point sources, so you don't have nearby nodes and you don't have like a high background, you don't have an underlying jet, but just 2 point sources that offset from each other. And then use like short time slices so that they have as few counts as you use.
So sorry, can you repeat, please? So
you said that one problem with like finding the real offset is that in your jet there's nearby nodes and there's like possibly continuous emission that confuses. So how about you use like 2 stars, let's say, which we know to be point sources, and measure the offset between the 2 stars in the low count regime? I mean, just take like you did, take short exposures so that one of the stars, I'm sure Vinay or I, we can find one where one is bright and one is faint. And then you just make short time slices so that one of them has as few counts as you want, but you know it to be a point source. So you know there aren't any other nodes around and any other like jet features around and stuff. So any systematic uncertainty you find that must be from just the Chandra PSF and stuff like that.
Yeah, I think that's a good, I mean, I know that Karthik has been running a lot of simulations. He might talk about it later. But I think that's a good idea, Moritz. It's a good way to essentially calibrate the simulations. I agree.
Aren't you slightly worried about spectral differences between like the knots and your stars?
It shouldn't matter because LIRA is only a counts measuring thing. So, I mean, there may be a slight difference in the PSF that might.
Yeah, that's what
occur,
I was more
yes.
concerned about.
You can still, I mean, if you want, you could still know, you can resample your images and not take all the counts, but randomly choose counts in the energy band of interest. I mean, if your stars are bright enough, you can randomly sample from that and choose just counts that give you the spectrum that you want.
You have to be careful not that the stars are not too bright because of pileup.
Right.
Yeah.
But I mean, we could probably, we can't necessarily find one that's perfect for a large number of counts for all of these constraints, but we could probably find one that's getting you most of the way there. Doesn't have to be 2 stars. It could be any 2-point sources. It could be high mass X-ray, I mean, anything that we know to be 2-point sources close to each other.
I would just point out that because the PSF is asymmetric, that you probably want to find 2 stars which are along the same line as your 2 objects you're trying to measure the distance to.
Or close to it, right?
Close to it, yeah.
I mean, it's
Yeah, but it just the direction, the angular, the angular direction between the stars should be the same, because otherwise you'll be comparing different parts of the PSF. I'm not saying this well, but
yeah, and
no, I agree with that, but you also need ACES oriented the same if you're doing subpixel work.
Right. I was about to mention that you need to take into account the roll.
Well, yeah, but the PSF and ACES are the mirrors and ACES are always oriented with respect to each other with the same angle. Right, we're not turning the mirrors and keeping ACES straight, like we're turning the telescope.
No, but if you're looking at a point source on the sky, there's a roll involved. So you want to be considering it in the frame of the telescope, not the sky.
Right, in the frame of what Diab said, like in the frame of the telescope, they need to have the same the right orientation. But like it doesn't matter what the offset on the sky is because we'll turn the telescope to match that. Anyway, that's I think we need to.
But as you can see, it's not easy to select 2 stars. So Karthik was just doing simulations, but yeah, let's go back to the top.
We've observed plenty of clusters, right? If you go like think O and C or something, you also don't want
you have to make sure that everything is close to the A point, which is where most of these observations are. So, but I think if we look at the source catalog, right? I mean, there may be some sources that can be found, but yes, I mean, this is definitely a good idea that probably is worth exploring, but I think simulations perhaps are easier at this point, so maybe we should let Karthik continue.
Yeah, we don't have simulations of a PSF like a priori first principle simulation of the PSF asymmetry.
Right.
So in this particular source, it shows a double peak structure in the hotspot region, which was known to previously exist from the optical data. There was this another source where if you look at the brightness profile in the X-rays for this jet, it shows a roughly flat profile. And this can be used as an evidence for ICCMB mode of emission, because in ICCMB mode, the low energy electrons have much larger lifetimes than the radio emitting ones. So we can, in principle, expect to find a smoother profile in the X-rays than when compared to the radio. But the deconvolved images show knotty structure that's also in the X-rays, shows a rough correlation with the radio. There was this another source. Now this is a low power jet that unlike the high power jets that I've been describing about, and it's almost certain that the emission from these jets in the X-ray wavelengths is produced by synchrotron. But the interesting part here is the not B. In a previous analysis on not B, the authors found that there are two spectral components within the X-ray spectra, unlike other knots which show a simple power law spectrum. So the deconvolved images show two peaks, one that roughly coincide with the radio peak, and the other bright point-like structure that's slightly upstream of this knot. So it's possible that this is some kind of obstacle that's interacting with the jet, and then it's contaminating the emission in knot B. I'll also briefly describe an ongoing work on understanding the systematic uncertainties involved in measuring offsets using images from LIRA. So the setup is like this. There is a Gaussian source to represent the core, and then 5 other Dell'Or functions scattered around the core to represent the knots. I'm using different sets of PSFs to simulate observations, like one from SAO trace, one Gaussian PSFs with different widths and introducing some asymmetry on a Gaussian PSF. And what I'm doing is I'm introducing different core counts, different knot counts, and then for each combination of core and knot count, I'm simulating 5 observations, and then I'm also introducing different backgrounds for different sets of simulations. So this is a sample observation with 5,000 core counts and 130 knot counts, and this is how the LIRA average image looks like. So for each knot region, I'm estimating the centroid on the LIRA iteration, and then computing its offset from the actual location of the knot that I specified. So this is one distribution from the PSFs with PSF with the SAO trace simulations. It appears that the at a few counts, like 10 to 20, the offset can reach up to a pixel, but at higher counts, the offset appears to be around 0.2 to 0.3 pixels. So for a half ACIS S pixel, this is going to be around 0.08 arc seconds. So in my study, what I'm doing is I'm requiring each offset to be at least above at least 1 sigma level above 0.15 arc seconds to consider it as a significant offset. So I'll discuss some results that I found from this offset analysis. So one thing that I found was that in roughly half the number of knots, I find that the X-rays peak and decay before the radio. I denote them the X-ray first or the XF type, and then in nearly equal number of knots, the knots, they don't show any significant offsets, and in only a few percentage of knots, the X-rays appear to peak beyond the radio, but there. So in these knots, the jet actually vanishes at that point and re-emerges at a further location. So it suggests that the X-rays are perhaps coming from some shock-heated obstacle that's deflecting the jet, and probably not from the jet at all. Now, one problem in claiming a co-spatial offset is that these knots are subject to projection effects and distance effects. So if we take a knot with a significant offset and align it closer to a line of sight or put it at a larger distance, it's going to get reduced below the detection threshold. So to understand the effect of these two, to understand the extent of projection and distance effect, I constructed a categorical parallel coordinates plot. So CDQs are core-dominated quasars or closely aligned jets. LDQs are lobe-dominated quasars or having with moderately misaligned jets, and FR2s have highly misaligned jets. Now, clearly the sample is imbalanced. So the way to read this plot is each stripe represents a group of one or more knots with identical coordinates. So for example, if I have a set of few knots in CDQs, which have superluminal motions in their parsec scale speeds, which suggests that their jets are closely aligned, then they reside in a redshift of 0.07 to 0.35, and they have an acceptable offset. Now, if we consider the fraction of knots with offsets and knots without offsets, the FR2s and the fraction increases as the jet gets more aligned, or the number of knots with co-spatial offset without any significant offsets are predominantly coming from jets with superluminal sources, and they're also located at a larger distance than the jets that we find several offsets. So this suggests that perhaps projection and distance effects are also playing an important role in reducing any offsets that we could detect in these knots. And also, I tested for the differences between the knots with offsets and knots without offsets using two signature parameters. The one is the X-ray to radio flux ratio, and the other is by testing for differences in their distributions of spectral indices. The current data doesn't show any significant difference, but also so this suggests that these knots probably all of these knots probably have offsets. So we are unable to detect them because of limited resolution, but other alternative explanation could be that the sample is clearly imbalanced, and you also don't have several knots to firmly conclude anything. And then I next looked at the distributions of projected offsets. Now, because the exact alignment angle of these jets is unknown, I'm using a simple schematic and assigning representative angles to these jets. So smaller angles for CDQs, moderately higher angles for LDQs, and larger angles for FR2s. Now to the left, I plot a distribution of deprojected offsets in knots with X-ray first type, and I also stack them with the co-spatial knots by assuming a certain threshold of 0.15 arc seconds. To the right, I plot the distribution of these offsets, but dividing them between different classes. Now, the quasar classes tend to show larger offsets than their FR2 counterparts. I'll get back to that in a moment. But this plot shows that the distributions of offsets are similar, and they
Karthik?
Yeah.
I'm slightly confused by the left plot. How can you have offsets and also co-spatial superposed?
Oh, I'm just assuming a threshold as an upper limit. So I'm using 0.15 arc second upper limit offset on these co-spatial knots. If they have an offset, it's going to be less than that.
I see. So the blue curve is just a sort of distribution of that is kind of it could actually be skewed further to the right.
Okay. Yeah. It's I only included it for completeness, but it won't make any difference in the further analysis that I do.
Okay.
Yeah. So the interesting thing about this plot is that the offsets are mostly similar, and they're also on the same order as sizes of knots at low redshifts. So for example, this is a nearby jet called 3C353 with a knotty structure in the radio, and the general morphology of these knots is that the radio knots appear extended along the jet, while the X-rays are confined to much more compact regions. Now, the plot that I showed earlier contains some mixture of resolved and unresolved knots. And in general, if the knot is resolved along the jet, at least, it appears to be extended. So if the offsets are being similar, whether or not the knots are resolved, then their similarity suggests that these knots probably have probably follow a same structure and probably produced by the same process. So to understand this effect, let's take this knot from a nearby jet. For example, it's from a jet called Centaurus A. The X-ray shows a compact morphology, while the radio shows an extended morphology. Now, if this knot becomes unresolved for the radio telescope, it's going to produce a point-like structure with its peak located close to the brightness distribution of the resolved knot. So in that case, the peak-to-peak offset, which I'm measuring in these knots, would represent a lower limit on the total extent of this knot. So that means if we align this knot at various angles or put it at different distances and make it unresolved to the resolution the telescope, the offsets, the deprojected offsets is going to produce will always be similar, and it's going to produce similar offsets. So if you are seeing similar offsets in a wide range of knots, then it suggests that these knots have the same structure, namely extended morphology in the radio and a compact structure in the X-rays. Now, in most of the deconvolved images, the X-rays they don't show any evidence for an extended emission with sizes on the same order as the radio. So compact regions are going to be a problem for the inverse Compton model, because in the inverse Compton model, the X-rays are produced by low energy electrons, which have much larger lifetimes than the radio emitting synchrotron electrons. So we could expect also extended morphologies in the X-rays, but it won't be a problem for the synchrotron, because synchrotron electrons that produce X-rays have much shorter lifetimes than the radio emitting ones. So what could possibly be producing this kind of morphology? So if we take radio images of jets in general, these knots, the brightness profiles of these knots are independent of frequencies in the radio wavelengths. So this observation led several authors to suggest that these knots are probably some kind of separate moving blobs of plasma with excess kinetic powers. So these blobs of plasma will be surrounded by slower moving outer flow, and it's possible that they produce a forward reverse shock structure in the downstream region of this blob. But one problem would be that if we cannot explain why it could produce an XF type offset. So this led Katoka et al. To suggest that these knots are probably heavy moving blobs of plasma embedded in a faster and lighter outer flow. So in that case, what could happen is that, so this is the knot that I showed from the previous image from the 3C353 one. It's the radio image, and then this red circle indicates the location of the X-ray emission. So what they suggested was that there is a faster and lighter outer flow that collides with the upstream end of this blob to produce a reverse shock, and then that reverse shock could produce X-rays. and the radio emission would coincide with this blob. One problem here would be that if we progressively remove the radio flux from this blob, it shows peaks on the edges of the jet, which means the emission is probably coming from some kind of a surface rather than something that occupies the entire cross section of the jet. So again, there is this issue with, although it can explain the XF type offsets, it's again an issue with how we observe the radio emission. So we can slightly modify what's happening here by saying that if the jet interacts with this blob and the produced shocked particles emit in the X-rays and also join the outer flow while advecting downstream. So while this plasma advects downstream, it's going to emit via synchrotron, and it's going to be at progressively longer wavelengths. But one problem again here is that the offsets produced in that way would be around 100 kiloparsecs rather than the observed ones, which are on the order of a few kiloparsecs. So there could be, it is possible that this emission flows around the obstacle to produce some kind of shear boundary layer, or it's possible that there is already an existing boundary layer in the jet to which these accelerated particles diffuse into. So that will reduce the total size of the knot. In an ongoing study in our group, we are finding that the X-ray, the radio and optical spectrum, the emission requires two spectral components to describe them. So in principle, a forward shock developed in this blob could also produce optical emission. So that way we can create 3 different spectral components to explain 3 different parts of the spectrum. So if these knots are moving, then deprojection has to contain an additional factor of delta, which is the Doppler boost given by this formula. So the process here is that as a linear object moves faster and aligns closer to our line of sight, we'll see its magnified version. So this delta is going to correct for that magnification. Now, proper motion studies on a nearby jet called CC273 have placed an upper limit on the total speed of these knots. So if I use this as an upper limit and then recorrect the deprojected offsets, now these offsets peak at much smaller values, which are more representative to be a lower limit on the total extent of these knots. And also that the quasars and the FR2s, the offsets in those sources become much more uniform. So if these knots are moving, the distances between these knots can also tell us something about the time period on which these knots are emitted, probably by some kind of intermittent activity in the jet. So I computed the distances between these knots and then estimated the time scale based on by assuming a bulk tolerance factor of 3. Then the return time period is about 3 times 10 to the 4 years, which is a factor of 3 about a factor of 3 smaller than the estimated intermittent activity time scale in different contexts. So it's possible that we are overestimating the bulk tolerance factor of these knots, or it's possible that we are the angles are underestimated. And next, so there was one proposal in the context of ICCMB model suggesting that there is a fast spine in the jet surrounded by a slower sheath. So this fast spine would produce X-ray emission via the ICCMB mechanism, and then the sheath would produce the radio. So if that were the case, we could see some kind of differences between the luminosity distributions in X-rays and the radio. So the idea here is that if the X-ray emitting plasma resides in a faster moving jet flow, the separation between the luminosity in knots in misaligned jets, which I assign under a group for FR2s and LDQs, is going to be larger in the X-rays than when compared to the radio. But the current data shows no significant difference or separation between these two distributions. So it suggests that probably these the radio and X-ray emitting plasmas both reside in similar plasmas with similar jet speed, but alternatively, the X-ray knots in these closely aligned jets may have smaller intrinsic luminosities, and it's wiping out any observable correlation. Next, I did the same experiment with the X-ray radio flux ratios by dividing the knots into two groups, CDQs, closely aligned, and FR2s with moderately and highly misaligned jets. So the expectation here is that if the ICCMB is producing these X-rays, as the jet gets aligned more closer to a line of sight, the X-rays will see more amplification than the radio. So we can expect a difference in the distributions of X-ray radio flux ratios between CDQs as one group and FR2s, LDQs as one group. But the current data doesn't show any huge difference, but also it's a small sample, so the statistical power is too low to firmly confirm anything. I'll also share some optimizations that I've been doing on the LIRA code. So what I'm doing is I'm using...
before you get to the LIRA, though, I have a question, yeah. Karthik. Yeah. So if you go back to your, the first one where you do the deprojection based on estimated gamma.
Mm-hmm.
I think
this one?
The one before that, I think. Yeah. So do I understand you correctly that you chose a single gamma to do the deprojection?
Mm-hmm. Right.
Wouldn't it be better to just take the known distribution, or maybe just assume it, I don't know, something flat distribution on gamma, and so that you get a better sense of what the spread actually looks like?
You mean assign different gammas to different knots from a
distribution? No, I mean, since you don't know what the gamma is, maybe you should, what I was suggesting was something like a bootstrap, picking different gammas for different, not bootstrap, so Monte Carlo, picking different gammas for different realizations, and then seeing, and then sort of combining all the distributions together.
Oh yeah, yeah. That's also.
I mean, I don't think it'll change your result, because as long as it'll just make the distributions broader, and it'll make the statistical power even lower, but it'll be a more accurate determination of the power.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I'll probably do that.
Dan raised the hand.
Can you go back to the slide with the equations? Yes.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, so I'm confused about the deprojection because I'm thinking that the sine of theta is going to tend to be 1 over delta. I mean, it'll be a little smaller maybe, but so I don't see the differences in the deprojected versus projected. That's just a comment maybe.
Yeah, but I'm fixing this theta based on the spectral class. So
okay, but then you may not be getting a realistic distribution of theta for the different delta factors. I think that's similar to what Vinay was saying.
Mm-hmm.
David Murphy in his thesis actually derived a priori distribution of sine theta for different deltas based on the boosting factor that you get from a delta, and based on actually earlier work that, gee, I forget who did the earlier work. But it could give a different kind of prior for the
I don't know, Dan,
Dan, you're muted.
yeah, Dan is muted, but I was wondering if this was the end of the comment, or you still were saying something, Dan?
No, I was trying to, I didn't lower my hand, sorry.
Okay.
No. So I also worked on optimizing the LIRA code using SIMD intrinsics. So it's the it's a short name for a single instruction multiple data. So to give a brief overview on how this thing could speed up. So in a typical CPU operation, let's say we have 4 numbers and we want to triple them. The typical CPU operation would be we copy this into the CPU, we copy number 3 into the CPU, we multiply it and store it back into the main memory. So that means we perform 12 different operations on these 4 numbers, but and using the SIMD intrinsics, so in modern processors, they have this extra space to copy other numbers to and then compute them simultaneously. So using the SIMD intrinsics, now we can simply copy all the 4 numbers at once, triple them at once, and then copy them back into the mean. So that means we are effectively performing only 3 operations as opposed to 12 operations. So in principle, this can give us a speed boost of 4 times. So I changed the data structures in the algorithm to be in 1D instead of being in 2D, and then I've used this intrinsics to optimize the code, and it results in a 3 to 4 times speed boost in the program runtime. This is an experimental Python package is available with the name PyLIRA_SIMD if you'd like to try it out. But it will be a fully tested version will be included in the upcoming PyLIRA package on the AstroStats main repo that Axel's working on. And finally, I've also built a dashboard to summarize all the results from this work. So this will have 3 different tabs. One tab you can interactively explore multidimensional relations between the data points. For example, this one shows the lobe luminosity of the source at 300 megahertz versus the redshift. We can filter the sources. We can scale the sources. For example, here it's scaled according to beta apparent, and it's colored according to the number of nodes with offsets in that particular source. And then you can also download all the data sets, the high resolution radio images, X-ray maps, and also the deconvolved ones. This is right now at the moment the data is not updated, but it will be updated and will be released along with the paper that I'll be submitting in the next month. And alternatively, it also offers a traditional view where we can simply browse through the tabular data or filter them just like we do on Excel. So to conclude, this offset analysis suggests that probably all of these nodes have offsets, and we are unable to detect them because of a limited resolution problem. And these offsets also say that we definitely need a 2-zone model instead of 1-zone models to explain the X-ray emission from them. And the distributions of these offsets suggest that these nodes could be produced by heavy moving blobs that are in turn produced by some kind of intermittent activity in the jet. No, there is, but these offsets, they don't put any hard constraints on the actual X-ray emission mechanism in the 2-zone model, but there isn't any evidence against firm evidence for a one-zone ICCMB model or one-zone synchrotron model in the current data. A future work that I'm interested in and to know is what could be the emission between the knots. So if these low energy electrons that cool after emitting the radio, they could serve as seed electrons for further ICCMB emission. So I'd be interested in to know what could be that inter-knot emission, and it would require changing the prior in LIRA, which is currently optimized for mainly detecting point sources. But yeah, I hope to look into that in a future work. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Karthik. This is very nice. Yeah, we have to do this. So one comment, you said two-zone model. There could be multi-zone model. It doesn't need to be two. It's right. Right?
Yeah.
Multi-zones, and we probably, on this large scale, I suspect we have multi-zones. It's
Yeah, especially given the results from the ALMA analysis, which is showing a turnover at those frequencies, and we are requiring another spectral component in the infrared. So yeah, it's at least 3 different emission mechanisms there.
Yeah, we usually start with simple model, one zone, but then you realize that's limited, right? And you have to expand.
Yeah.
And also, yeah, when you were showing this boundary emission with 3C353, I just remember the recent image from radio image for, I guess this is Sene, very close to the core, where you see this boundary, sort of 2 streams, and the same morphology is visible in M87 jet, very close to the core. So this, this kind of boundary on emission in the jet in radio is definitely visible close to the core, right? Very close to the launching point.
Right. I did the same experiment. Let me get back to the image. I did the same experiment with the other knots as well. In these knots, there is a bridge-like structure in the upstream edge of these knots. So that is also one more interesting point there. Like, is it like an outer flow that's flowing around this knot? And so that's great. In fact, in a detailed polarization study on this particular object, the magnetic field lines appear to be perpendicular to the jet in the mid regions, and they are parallel to the jet in the outer region. So
you have a different magnetic field structure. Okay, Dan has a question.
Yeah, the measurement of the separations are clearly important, and clearly they exist. But I would just like to ask the statisticians here. I'm kind of bothered by what sort of looks like an apples to oranges comparison of the X-ray peaks, which you've elaborately described how you get them, versus the radio peaks. The radio, of course, is an interferometer that resolves out larger spatial scales. And I think the data that you're using is data of clean FITS files, which are just multiple point sources in radio, essentially. But you're not doing that. So you're not doing the same mathematical operations on the radio data as on the X-ray data. That's the point. So it's sort of a question for the statisticians.
I mean, definitely the interferometer isn't resolving the internal weather of this knot, but if the structure in the radio is elongated, then the peak is going to be at a different place. So is what I'm thinking.
That's actually a different problem that's always bothered me. In fact, I think Dan Harris is the one that first mentioned it. If the X-ray synchrotrons don't propagate very far, the X-ray synchrotron and the X-ray emitting synchrotron electrons don't propagate very far, so they must be accelerated there. So wherever they're accelerated should also be the peak of the radio emission. But the morphology in some of your objects, the radio emission is clearly higher further downstream. And I don't understand how that can happen physically.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, comparing those data sets would obviously be really challenging to do something formal because of all the reasons you're saying. You know, I've always, the astronomers would be better than me as a statistician to address what I'm about to say, but I've always thought that with the X, when we looked at the radio and compared it with the X-rays, it was really more of a qualitative comparison, not a formal comparison.
Mm-hmm.
For all of the reasons you're saying. Yeah, it gives us a reason to look in a particular spot for something interesting in the X-ray, but not a formal statistical comparison.
Yeah.
The radio data are of different nature than X-ray, right? I mean, they're not Poisson. So it's difficult to apply the same procedure to both data sets. That's that too. So I don't know how we would resolve that issue.
Yeah.
One I think difficult method would be to like look at the UV data to understand if you could extract some details on the structure. Like say we put in different types of sources and then solve the telescope radio telescope equation and then compare it to the UV data from the observation. So it's like a brute force method to extract the distribution there, but yeah, it's.
So in radio, I thought like that it is possible to fit these point sources in the radio jet, right? Just to get the idea of where the peak is.
Mm-hmm.
So when you were describing the peak in radio, you were looking at the contours only, right? And looking at the contour peak, not really fitting the radio data with the these Gaussian structures.
No, I'm fitting each radio knot with a Gaussian and then I'm extracting its location.
Okay, I don't think you said that. Maybe.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay, all right. Yeah. So there is some uncertainty on that position in radio too.
Mm-hmm.
Right? If you fit that, you have this uncertainty on the location of the radio peak.
Mm-hmm.
Also contributes to the uncertainty in the displacement of those.
Yeah, but I think that's on the order of like milliarc seconds. Usually yeah.
But the point Dan was raising is that depending on the frequency, we don't get the full, frequency and the array, right? We don't get the full emission at given location in a jet. So there is some flux which is lost, right? And you don't include that.
Mm-hmm.
Whether this flux contributes to the peak or the offset, we don't know. I don't know anything about radio data. So
yeah, so let's say we have most of the emission here, and then some of the remaining emission over there. So the peak is going to be much more near to the bulk of the radio emission. So yeah, we'll definitely lose that diffuse emission part.
Mm-hmm.
But the peak that we locked in will be much more closer to the weighted average of the underlying brightness distribution. So if we are seeing an offset, then the bulk of the radio emission is probably not located closer to the X-ray node, but rather like far away from it.
But if I look now at this tool, so how do you generate this right B plot?
Oh, this was an image from the residual after a few cycles, and in removing it, I found the structure. But we can obtain the same structure by applying an edge filter to
Yeah. But when you look at it, there is, as you said, there is this kind of perpendicular emission, and I look at the red spot, right? Red spot, which is the X-rays, and I see that the radio around that circle is kind of maybe circular. So maybe that's where we have the corresponding X-ray and radio emission, and then this edge-like structure on both sides is something which is a result of these interactions which we already see on this common structure here. I guess you were making a point that there is an obstacle there. But when I look at this, then you can think about two types of offset, right? There is no offset between this center and maybe this radio emission around this red circle. And then there is another type of emission, which is along these edges of the jet, which is unrelated to what we're seeing here, and could be very different process because there is no corresponding X-rays on these edges. It's just this part.
Right.
Maybe, but I'm just speculating.
Yeah, one thing about like requiring one radio peak to coincide with the X-ray peak, like it's going those accelerated electrons, as they advance downstream, they are going to rejoin the flow, and there'll be other modifications. Like if there is a velocity structure, then it's going to get reprocessed again.
Right.
So maybe that radio peak is much fainter, that coincides with the X-ray peak, but it produces a larger peak more like downstream. Like this is I think this is so there is so this is Centaur SA, but it's probably an obstacle. But there is also a faint radio peak that closely follows that X-ray node. But as it rejoins the flow, it's going, those electrons are their spectra is going to get modified, and probably they emit much they become much brighter more downstream. So,
well, yeah, what's clearly needed is like this two-dimensional model of what's going on, physical model. So you can simulate these flows and see what's going on, which is not trivial. I mean, I guess there are these simulation codes which may have some of these physical properties in it, and maybe that's a way to look at these structures. Get the physical models and then simulate the observations from those models and see what you get.
Right. One more thing these offsets also point out is that like to what extent can equipartition be applied to X-ray nodes and radio nodes? Like like I mean, if the X-rays are produced at some form of a shock, then the particle densities, the magnetic field densities are going to be much larger in the X-rays, at least.
Interesting. Well, are there any other comments and questions? I guess we see. Oh, Herman is there. Herman, you didn't have any comments? No.
Dan's been doing a great job.
Okay. All right. Well, so thank you, everybody, and thank you, Karthik, for the presentation. So this is the last week of Karthik's visit. He's going back to Maryland. And so when is your thesis due?
I'm planning to defend in mid-May.
Mid-May, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So we'll talk later.
Yep.
All right, thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.